This is the Cato Daily Podcast for Wednesday, April 8th, 2020. I'm Caleb Brown. In the multi-trillion-dollar coronavirus relief bill passed by Congress, the military got only a tiny sliver, a far cry from its typical portion of the federal budget. It brings into sharp relief the fact that viruses don't care about the size of your army. Cato Institute Vice President Chris Preble details what that might mean for defense spending priorities going forward.
No, I think if we look at this sort of back up a little bit and we think about traditional threats to human security over time, right? For as long as we can, we know, human beings have fought with one another, they've threatened one another. And so traditional defenses against invasion and attack go back, to when we formed into, organized societies. And so for so long, our national security was organized in that way. And even to this day, our military is sort of postured in a way to deter threats and to retaliate in the event that those deterrents fail. I do think that 9/11 and terrorism in general was a different sort of problem in the sense that it was perpetrated by non-state actors, people who did not have a fixed location and all those other criteria that sort of differentiate them from traditional state threats like the Soviet Union or China, for example. And yet in that case, the military proved reasonably adaptable to being able to sort of pivot to dealing with both state and non-state actors and continue. And again, we could have a separate conversation on whether or not the decision to militarize the approach of counterterrorism was actually effective, or if a different approach might have been more effective. I suspect we might have tried something different, and it might have worked even better. But the point is, in the current environment, that the military instrument seems particularly ill-suited to deal with a faceless, nameless pathogen. In fact, as we've seen tragically over the course of the last week, the military is quite vulnerable to these pathogens, and so an aircraft carrier with close to 5,000 people in close quarters is a lot like a cruise ship in terms of the difficulty of containing the virus and things like that. So I think we're perhaps moving into a period where the allocation of resources to the military at the expense of other tools and public health. There are going to be some real trade-offs there, some hard trade-offs, I think, for the military going forward.
How has the military responded?
Well, I think that certain elements of the military are well positioned to deal with this problem. And so, of course, you have this massive healthcare system for the military. And so, famously, the HMS Comfort and the HMS Mercy, the two hospital ships in LA and New York, are the kinds of capacity that could be put to use in the event of an emergency. They've been used, for example, to deal with disaster relief after hurricanes and typhoons. So in that sense, there's a common thing. You have medical doctors and medical and nurses who are affiliated with the military, helping with sort of emergency hospitals that have been set up in major cities. So that's all fine. And then I've also written a little bit about, there is an infectious disease laboratory network that was mostly set up to deal with bioweapons, but those same labs have the kinds of skills and capabilities that could be put to use to deal with a virus that was not created for the purpose of being a weapon. So, there are some elements of the military that are useful in this crisis, but they are a tiny, tiny fraction of the total of the sort of military establishment, and so again, I think that there are going to be some real hard questions for, to be blunt about it. What exactly does an aircraft carrier have to do with defending people from an infectious disease? And the answer is none, or virtually none at all.
When you say difficult questions, presumably some of this has to do with military spending.
That's correct. I think that there are always trade-offs, of course, and in terms of military spending, usually we think about the trade-offs within the military budget because military spending has remained quite high consistently, even when the threats have come and gone. And so it's often become a competition between, is the Navy winning at the expense of the Army, or is the Army winning at the expense of the Air Force, et cetera. But again, I think now we're likely to see competition between the military as a whole and other instruments of the public health community and other aspects of the government power and influence that might be more useful, not just against this particular pathogen, but against future diseases. And again, we have to recognize the argument is that this is a black swan event. This is a unique, truly unique event in human history. At least, we go back to the Spanish influenza from 1918, 1919. So this is something that does not come along very often. How much do we want to reorient our approach on the basis of one outlier event? But the outlier event of 9/11 caused us to reorient pretty substantially. So in what ways is this unique outlier event very, very different from 9/11 or other cases like that?
As I spoke with Eric Gomez recently about the U.S. relationship with China, that's been damaged, as it has with China and various other countries around the world. But more broadly, what does this mean for grand strategy of the U.S. military?
Well, it's probably too soon to say definitively, but I think it's not too soon to speculate. So, for example, a lot of U.S. foreign policy, at least since the end of the Second World War, has been organized around the principle that the United States is reasonably secure and has excess capacity, or can make its excess capacity available to others who are under greater danger. So we did this during the Cold War for Western Europe that was threatened by the Red Army. Or in East Asia, we do this to deter, for example, Chinese attacks against or Chinese threats against our allies and partners in East Asia, with the argument being that we don't have to worry about the very proximate dangers because we're reasonably secure. Well, the difference today is that the danger is here with us. It's among us. It's not far away. And so it's harder to make the case, it seems to me, on sort of foreign policy and grand strategy grounds, that we have the luxury of worrying about distant threats when we're dealing quite literally with a matter of life and death right here in this country. It's a situation that we have fortunately been able to avoid throughout most of American history, frankly, that we just were insulated from very, very serious threats to the country. And if this threat rises to the level it appears to, where you're talking potentially about as many people dying from COVID-19 in 1 year as have died in all U.S. wars since the Second World War. I mean, that sort of puts things into perspective. And so I think we're likely to see a change in the way that U.S. foreign policymakers and national security strategists sort of think about distant threats as they relate to more proximate ones.
How did the Pentagon make out in this $2 trillion spending bill?
The military got a very, very small share, and about $10 billion out of $2 trillion. Compare that with the military in a typical year receives about 55% of discretionary spending. Just the military, just the Pentagon. And the share that the military got from the financial aid package was almost exclusively sort of focused on the additional expenses that the military will incur because of this disease. So in terms of thinking in the future about additional increments of money going to the military, perhaps at the expense of public health resources, things like that, I think this is an early indication that that competition is going to be quite fierce, and that it will be incumbent upon military planners to make a compelling case for why their particular weapon system or program is actually vital to the safety and health of the American people.
Chris Preble is Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Subscribe to the Cato Daily Podcast wherever you please, and follow us on Twitter @Cato Podcast.